My name is Algernon Austin. I'm the Director for Race and Economic Justice at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. The Center for Economic and Policy Research, also known as CEPR, was established to promote democratic debate on the most important economic and social issues that affect people's lives. Welcome to our final webinar in our four-part series commemorating the 60th anniversary of the March in Washington for Jobs and Freedom. These events are brought to you by CEPR as part of the Full Employment for All Coalition. You can find out more at the coalition about the coalition at fullemploymentforall.org. Before we begin our great panel discussion today, I want to inform you that if you missed any of the prior three spectacular panels, you'll be able to find recordings of them on the CEPR YouTube channel by the end of next week. We will email you when they are available. Also, this Saturday, there will be a 60th March on Washington event in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial. You can find out more and register for that event at MOW2023.com. That's MOW2023.com. Today's moderator is Jessica Fulton, Interim President and Vice President of Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. I'll now turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Algernon, and I'm really grateful to CEPR for hosting this discussion and inviting me to serve as moderator today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Basically, the format is that I have some questions for our panelists, and then we will open it up for Q&A at the end. So start thinking about what questions you have for these folks. But I will start by introducing our panelists. We are joined by Deidre Asante Mohammed from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, Adewale Maye from the Economic Policy Institute, Katie Euchre from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and Liz King from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. So I'm going to jump right into the conversation because I think we all want to hear from y'all. And I'm going to start with Deidre. So it's been 60 years since the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And that was an important flashpoint for the civil rights movement. Could you talk a little bit about where we've made progress since 1963 and also a little bit about where we've stagnated or maybe moved backwards?
Yes, yeah. We at the NCRC, National Community Reinvestment Coalition, just produced a report with the Institute for Policy Studies called Still a Dream, all focused on 60 years after the March on Washington. We were focusing more on the economic areas. And the areas where we saw some of the greatest improvement was like in 1963, there was really a stunningly high poverty rate for African Americans, right? Where this is poverty rates usually looked at in terms of income. And around 51% of African Americans were in poverty at that time period, while about 15% of whites. So if we go to 2021, we see the poverty rate has greatly declined. African Americans are about 20% poverty rate. Whites are around 8%. So, that's a substantial decrease, though obviously 20% is still 1 out of 5 Blacks in the United States in poverty. So it's still too high. But I do think that's important when we think about the March on Washington. What were the conditions that African Americans were living in, that the majority were living in? Income poverty is quite amazing to think about. And also actually the kind of sudden decrease. Right after the March on Washington, there was a war on poverty called by Lyndon Johnson, a lot of federal investments, many government programs. And we saw that by 1969, just about 6 years later, poverty had decreased by almost 20 percentage points, around the low 30% for African Americans. So we can see that when the nation mobilizes its resources, we can make some substantive changes. Just one other area where I'll note, substantive change is in terms of education. Radical increase in education. This is for all Americans. African Americans, I think it most stands out. Around 1962, about 25% of African Americans had a high school diploma. In 2022, you had 90% of African Americans have a high school diploma, and that's about equal to the rate of white Americans. And even in college attainment, you see a decrease in the divide. Whites had about 2.4 times more likely to have a college degree than Blacks in 1962. about 1.7 times more in 2022. So we've seen improvements in poverty as it relates to income in terms of education, high school, and even college attainment. But where we haven't seen substantial increases is in terms of income and in terms of wealth. Our report notes that in 1967, African Americans had 58 cents on every dollar of income that whites had. By 2021, African Americans had 62 cents on every dollar that whites had in income. So it took 60 years just to get that 4-cent bridging. And at that rate, the rate we've been going for the last 60 years, it would take another 513 years for African Americans just to reach income equality with whites. So, though it was a March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, it had a serious economic analysis. We can see that we haven't made the economic improvements that the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was advocating for. And we see it even slower decrease in terms of wealth, right? And I think wealth is the best indicator of socioeconomic positioning in the United States. And at the rate we've been for the last 60 years, it would take 780 years for African Americans to reach the wealth of whites. If we keep going at this very slow rate, where today African Americans still have only about 18 cents on every dollar of wealth of white. So there's still much to be done, and probably a clear new recommitment and really kind of radical, bold policy proposals if we want to get off this path of really ongoing economic apartheid.
That's a really, thank you for sharing that data and the information on how long how short it could be, right, in terms of the war on poverty, or how long something could take if we don't make intentional policy change. That's really, really striking. Relatedly, the march had several demands, right? And Adewale, half of them were critically important economic justice demands. How have we progressed on these demands and on economic inequality since 1963?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So since 1963, there have been both advancements and challenges in the pursuit of economic equality in the U.S. I think some of the core advancements were definitely the civil rights legislation. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws were helped implement or dismantle legal segregation and protect the voting rights of African Americans and other minority groups. Even though it's under attack right now, affirmative action policies were implemented to address historic inequalities in education and employment. These policies were aimed to promote diversity and equal opportunities for all marginalized groups. These were some of the advancements that came from or since 1963, but definitely when we think about the challenges, the inequities have definitely broadened over time. So EPI, we had just put out a report called Chasing the Dream, that's also kind of looking at Black workers or tracking Black workers from 1963 to now, what all constitutes to the well-being of a Black worker, how much we've progressed since the March on Washington, and if those demands have been met. A lot of the research that we found was that Black workers have consistently experienced unemployment rates that are roughly twice as high as those by white workers. Racial wage gaps have also persisted since the 1960s to present, highlighting enduring inequities within the labor market. Regarding wages, a typical Black worker is paid 23.4% less per hour than a typical white worker. Racial wage gaps also persist due to a combination of different factors, including a stagnant minimum wage, falling union coverage, and systemic factors such as occupational segregation, discrimination in hiring and pay, and inequitable pathways to promotion. Minimum wage policy in particular has impacted the Black-white wage gap in at least two distinct ways. One, lack of coverage for occupations disproportionately held by Black workers, and the failure to increase the minimum wage over time. Similar to what Diedrich had mentioned regarding like wealth, the legacy of redlining and other discriminatory practices like exclusionary zoning have kept Black families from achieving broad home ownership, building wealth, and also accessing affordable housing. So these are just a snapshot of some of the challenges and advancements since 1963, but definitely shows how much work we still have to do and how some of the demands of the march have still yet to be realized.
Thank you. We've got a ways to go. Liz, the demands of the march were largely about undoing the systemic anti-Blackness that holds back progress across the country, right? And the conversation so far has shown how much progress we still need to make in tearing down barriers to the economic freedoms of Black people. And at the same time, we also see anti-Blackness continuing to entrench itself in sort of policymaking and how this country operates. Could you talk a little bit about how we see anti-Blackness continuing to show up and in some cases even being further entrenched?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I mean, two of the original demands were explicitly about education. So adequate and integrated education and desegregation of all school districts in 1963. This was already 9 years after Brown v. Board of Education had found segregated schools to be unconstitutional. Obviously, this was not about proximity to white children. Black children didn't need to be around white children in order to learn, but it was about access to resources. It was about access to power, and it was about access to quality education. So we see in many ways attacks on the way in which anti-Blackness is manifesting itself in education right now. Dr. King in a different speech made reference to segregation. He talks about segregating Southern minds from honest thinking, and as one of the effects of segregation at the time. And so I think we see a lot of that happening. The attacks on Black history in Florida and Arkansas, especially the attacks on AP African American Studies, but not just Florida and Arkansas, in lots of other places, in the name of protecting children, presumably white children, from so-called divisive concepts. We've heard already references to the attacks on affirmative action, in spite of the obvious benefit to all students of learning in a more diverse and inclusive environment. Attacks on student loan debt cancellation, which is disproportionately about Black student loan debt borrowers. And the recognition, or the failure to recognize, I guess, that higher education was publicly funded until it became more inclusive. Then the burden was shifted onto individual students. Now we're pushing for that burden to go back onto the public as it was before in the form of debt cancellation. And we're seeing a resistance to that in a way that is really about denying Black children and Black families access to education. We're seeing retrenchments on school discipline reform and supports for criminalizing policies in schools, which disproportionately harm Black children, especially Black children at the intersections of other marginalized identities. So Black children with disabilities, LGBTQ youth who are Black. We're seeing the continued failure to act on the crisis in early care and education. Our early care and education system is not working for anybody. It's not working for children or families or providers, all of whom are disproportionately families of color and disproportionately Black. And then just the ongoing denial of equal or equitable education funding. So we see that in underfunding of schools and school districts with a larger share of Black children. So it is an ongoing systemic attack on the intellectual opportunity and educational opportunity, intellectual pursuits of Black children and Black families. That has continued. It has changed. We heard reference to some of the really important statistics about progress. Just to kind of end with that, right now, well, I guess in 2019, there were a larger share of Black people under the age of 25 had a college degree than had a high school diploma in 1960, which is a tremendous amount of educational progress that came at no small cost to individuals and their families. But we also heard talk of near universal high school graduation, which is a reminder that the pro-Blackness of the 60s, what came out of the March on Washington, really did lead to educational opportunity for everyone and has created a more educated population as a whole. We as a nation are better educated because of the focus in Black communities on Black education and universal education. So, and then one other, we talk about a lot about the attacks on AP African American Studies, and the College Board really screwed up how they handled that, and they backed off in ways that they shouldn't have. But we also see, 800 high schools are planning on offering AP African American Studies this fall. That's twice as many as they were expecting. That means a large number of children are going to have access to benefit from that content, really robust, thoughtful content that helps them better understand American history and prepare them to be future leaders. So there is some encouragement, there is some encouraging news ahead, but certainly a long way to go to ensure real educational opportunity.
Thank you. I want to shift a little bit to talk about workers. So Katie, the march included some specific demands to expand the rights of workers in this country. Could you talk a little bit about where we stand in terms of workers' rights today?
Yeah, thanks so much. And it's such an honor to get to be a part of this group discussion today. So appreciate the opportunity. So you're right, the 1963 march, it really did center economic justice in the struggle for equality. And 4 of the 10 demands of the marchers sought to directly advance workers' rights and employment opportunities. Now, of those 4 demands, only 1 has been somewhat realized. And that was a call for federal prohibition barring discrimination by employers, contractors, employment agencies, and unions. And that we saw in the passage of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it's woefully inadequate as it stands today, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But the other 3 demands I wanted to start with first, because those have really been largely unmet, as Adewale touched on. The first one was a federal training and employment program for all workers that provides access to meaningful and dignified jobs. So let's think about that, access to dignified jobs. What does that look like today? So the low-paid labor market is marked by low wages, few, if any, employee benefits, unpredictable scheduling that makes it kind of impossible to have a job, especially if you're a parent, and pervasive discrimination and other violations of workplace rights. There's also a very real, justified fear of retaliation by workers. And we know that the low-wage workforce is predominantly filled by Black and brown workers, and especially women of color. And workers of color in the low-paid workforce tend to be the lowest paid in those jobs. They're also grossly underrepresented in management positions, and they have the worst job insecurity. So they're the first to be laid off or fired and last hired. And so that's the situation now. And a large reason for this has to do with the degradation of labor rights in this country since the 60s. So we've seen a real unwillingness to meaningfully fight against corporate efforts to rein in unions and union power. But studies have shown over and over that the rise of a big part of the rise in income inequality that Diedrich was talking about is attributable to the decline of labor unions. And research shows that when there are organizing and unionization efforts, that Black workers stand to gain the most. They get a bigger wage boost when they're unionized than the average wage boost across all racial groups. And they also have reported experiencing better job protection from discriminatory treatment in a union setting. But union workers, we know, also are much more likely to have health insurance, are more likely to have retirement plans. And most importantly, they have, all workers have this, but they have the right to make changes and improve their own working conditions. And that's something that's a little known and exercised right that extends to non-union workers too. One high point, I think, right now that we can point to is the incredible moment that labor is having, especially new labor and Black-led labor. The example of the Amazon Labor Union being an exceptional one of success. Now, there's lots of room to go, but we are seeing a moment where labor is flexing their power again and beginning to. So this is like a high point. But really, we need to make it so that workers are able to collectively bargain and organize in order to improve their own working conditions and get access to those better jobs. That's key to this. Another one of the original demands was for a minimum wage that meets the cost of living. Now, at the time, the marchers were calling for a minimum wage that provides a decent standard of living. What they called for at the time was $2.19. That's equivalent to $19 per hour in today's dollars. But today, we know that nearly half of all working Black and Latino workers earn less than $15 an hour, compared to about a quarter of white workers. And it's been 14 years, the longest time in the history of the Minimum Wage Act, that Congress has raised the federal minimum wage. Now, in some states, they have passed their own minimum wages so that they're higher than the federal $7.25 that it is now. But still, in 20 states, the wage is stuck there. And that in my home state of Texas, you know, it's $7.25 an hour, and there are many people who don't even make that. So if you work full time, if you're a full-time worker earning the minimum wage and you don't take any days off, you're making $15,000 a year. That's subsidizing companies, right, to pay wages. I mean, we're subsidizing companies because you cannot live on $15,000 a year. So there is a proposal, the Raise the Wage Act of 2023, which would lift the minimum wage to $17 per hour over the next 5 years. And this is one of the most powerful tools that we can use to address racial disparities in income, because it would impact low-paid workers of color at a much greater extent than all others. And then one other thing I wanted to talk about, and then I'll pass the mic because I've been talking a while, but is one of the demands was also to expand the minimum wage and overtime laws to reach all workers. And that's because at the time that the employment rights, including the minimum wage law, was passed at the federal level in the 1930s during the New Deal, Congress specifically excluded the occupations from these laws that were predominantly filled by Black workers. And there's actually testimony from Congress, from like the congressional floor, where Southern Democrats are saying there's no way that we can pay Black workers the same as white workers. And so rather than put those racial distinctions explicitly in the law, which they knew would not pass constitutional muster even then, they instead used occupations as proxies. And so they excluded farm workers and domestic workers and tipped workers, which were the occupations that were predominantly filled by Black workers in the South at that time, as a way to keep the plantation economy going and keep a large group of workers without the same protections to their exploitation. And so some of these exclusions, which were explicitly racist, still exist today. We see remnants of them today. And we've got to go back and fix those laws, because there's no reason why, other than its racist history, why these exclusions exist. And now industries say today, well, that they're exceptional, that there's something special about agriculture, domestic work, and the service industry that makes it so that they can't pay their workers the same that all other industries pay their workers. But that's just not true. The sky has not fallen on the economy in states that have fixed these racist exclusions. So we need to fix that shameful history and stop this exploitation, especially when we think about what an essential role those workers hold in our economy. And we see that this exclusion from labor laws and employment laws continues today through the form of worker misclassification, or when you're called an independent contractor or told you're not really my employee, but you're actually doing the work of the company. And this has become a practice. This is sort of the new form of occupational exclusion. I've heard someone say it is the new Jim Crow, it's this occupational exclusion, which is growing exponentially across all sectors of our society. You see it in nursing, you see it in teaching at the college level, you see it. I mean, pick a company, you're going to find someone who really should be an employee, but is getting 1099. And that's important because If you're 1099 and you're being treated as an independent contractor, you don't have any rights. You don't have basically no rights. You have no right to the minimum wage, overtime, unemployment, workers' comp, medical leave, or any of the protections under the anti-discrimination statutes. Yeah. So it's very, it's very important that we fix these laws that are continuing to exclude vast sectors of our workforce that are predominantly Black and brown workers, so that everyone gets the same protections under the law, and we don't have this caste system that is perpetrated by these exclusions. I'll stop now, but I'm happy to talk more about sort of where we stand in terms of employment discrimination statutes as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Katie. I want to remind the audience that you can add questions to the Q&A box now that we've heard from all of our panelists. And we will start the Q&A period in about 20 minutes, but I do have a few more questions for our panelists before we start that portion. So this is really for anyone to answer. So in 1963, civil rights activists were struggling against the American system of apartheid known as Jim Crow. We have a lot of challenges to economic justice and civil rights today. What advantages or disadvantages do activists have today to make progress that didn't exist in 1963? So sort of, how are we better off or worse off than we were in terms of making change happen than we were in 1963?
Great, I guess I'll jump in and others can come in as well. I mean, and I noted this in the beginning. Clearly we're at a different space than we were in 1963, right? We highlighted kind of change in income poverty, and I think that's really substantial. I think a family of three today would be considered in poverty around $21,000 or less. So just the incredible economic insecurity that African Americans faced back in that time period, it was still much more de facto Jim Crow. It is less by law and tradition. I think it's more by economics, the segregation we have. So we still have segregation in schools, segregation in neighborhoods, but with money, oftentimes those things can be overcome. So that's a space. Also, I think African Americans have a much higher voter registration, voter participation than we've had in the past. So, and have many more Black elected officials. So in those ways, we're situated with assets and not even including modern technology, easy to talk to each other by phone or through social media or internet. So we have much greater ways of communication. So we have a lot more tools for activism. I think, though, the question is, how do we use these tools to change the will of a country that really hasn't had the will over the last 60 years to put in the amount of resources required to actually, bridge this racial economic inequality? Dr. King had said, in his lifetime that we have the resources, we just don't have the will. And I think it's really going to, take all of the resources we have today to try to push the country to have the will that it hasn't had in generations, even though the country has shown even recently that when there's a crisis, they can pull together billions, trillions of dollars, right? Whether it's COVID, whether it's the Great Recession, bailing out banks, even whether it's wars abroad, the country can pull together immediately, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. Our work is to get them to pull together that type of investment to deal with this foundational issue of the United States, the racial wealth divide.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything DJ had mentioned. I think that, as cliche as it is to say, probably one of the biggest advantages for activists is social media and just the global reach that's afforded with technology, allowing people to, help mobilize bases and support different various causes. I think that's that communication is definitely a pro. But I also think that the same platforms that enable activists to spread their messages can also be used to spread misinformation. So I think that's probably one of the biggest disadvantages today, and definitely contributes to the polarization that we probably see within policy, within just in terms of just regular conversations. Activists may need to navigate through, a plethora of false information claims to address like deep divisions within our economy or within society broadly.
Yeah, I would say one of the advantages right now is just how robust the coalition infrastructure is. So obviously the 1963 March was a partnership between Black liberation organizations and labor, and we still have those partnerships, but we also have, Latino organizations and Asian American organizations and LGBTQ organizations and disability organizations and a broad universe of marginalized people coming together and recognizing a shared struggle for liberation. And I think that's incredibly encouraging. And along with that also is just an intersectional lens and perspective on the work, right? So if we think about what Dorothy Height's critique of the 1963 March and the underrepresentation of Black women in that moment, we are now, I think there is a broader recognition that gender justice and disability justice need to be a part of this broader movement, and how all of this, people showing up with intersectional identities, makes us stronger and makes our work more effective. So I think those are some advantages that we have, obviously building on the work that was done prior to and during the 63 March.
Yeah, I think building on what Liz said, that there's more of a widespread acknowledgement of the benefits and needs of integrating our economy and fully integrating all members of our society into our economy. And it's ridiculous that we had to actually learn that and be convinced of it as a country, but we do have the benefit of 60 years of progress to show that. And I think there's just a more widespread, broad acknowledgement of the benefits of having a more diverse diverse workforce and the contributions of everyone included. So there's more of an acknowledgement, especially from the corporate sector. And I think, some of us can cynically say that is, more maybe not always 100% genuine, but I also believe that the vast majority of companies are completely convinced that when we allow the best talent to sit at the table, when we include all perspectives and reduce biases, that it leads to better innovation and efficiency. And it's actually imperative for our society to be able to tackle the most vexing of our problems. We cannot do that, and we cannot compete as a country if we don't have the best talent at the table contributing skills. So I think there's just a more of a broad recognition of that than there was in 1963.
I think that those are all really great points, and I think the folks on this call and people who watch this afterwards should definitely think about the points he raised and the opportunity to build on what we think are advantages to keep the movement moving forward. So thinking back to the original demands of the march in 1963, what one policy, and I think you're allowed to have two people can have the same one, though I don't know if you will. What one policy could policymakers enact to move us forward in a meaningful way, and why is it important? Why do you think that it would benefit our communities?
I was trying not to go first, but no one else seems to be jumping in. So I'll go first again. I can't handle silence for too long, so I'll jump back in. I think one of the ones I'd focus most on, again, coming from my economic frame, racial economic frame, is this idea of full employment, full job training that places all Americans with a focus on African Americans into full employment. African Americans have really never hit, and it's debated what is full employment. Oftentimes 4% for nationally was considered full employment, and African Americans have never hit that level. We have hit some record low levels of unemployment, I believe around 5% a few months ago. But usually African Americans are 2 times the unemployment level of whites. So the last 4 or 5 years, we've gotten down to 1.75, 1.6. So made some progress there. But for African Americans to really be in full employment would provide some increases in income, increases in financial security that I think is really important. I think one thing that I think is missing, and this still was in the early 60s, and I think the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even early 60s, a lot of the focus was income for economic inequality. I think as you get more into maybe 80s and post that, you start looking more at wealth. And I think, the idea of, though I will put forward actually one of the greatest increases in home ownership happened during the 50s and 60s, where whites became majority homeowners during that time period. And Blacks today have still about the same disparity in home ownership, about 30%, as they did back in the 1960s. So I think a strong home ownership program is necessary, and other type of wealth building programs as being more commonly discussed, baby bonds or some type of individual development asset programs. But I think that using the 1963 demands, I would say full employment, because that's an important asset, strong income, and I would look to add some more wealth building programs that I think is essential to move us forward.
I'll jump in here too. I think Katie had mentioned the Raise the Wage Act of 2023. I think that would be a huge policy vehicle. I know EPI's analysis shows that raising the federal minimum wage to $17 by 2028 would impact a little more than 27 million workers, which is about 19% of the US workforce. Of that, nearly a third of Black workers and 1/4, I believe, of Hispanic workers will get a raise in the federal minimum wage as well, if we're increased by $17 an hour, which I think really speaks to the point of creating a living wage instead of a minimum wage, where workers can provide for themselves, provide for their families, and feel as though that they're getting the pay that they feel like they deserve in order to sustain their livelihood and to embolden their economic security.
I would think I would add a solution or a fix to the Supreme Court's decision in Sandoval, which took away disparate impact, private rights of action under disparate impact in Title VI. And the need really, if we are going to eliminate discrimination in all its forms, we have to recognize how it shows up as structural and not just about this sort of interpersonal, signs over water fountains. And so both the robust use by DOJ of disparate impact as a tool under Title VI to remedy disparate impact discrimination, but then also access a private right of action to enable regular people to use this tool to really pursue the rights they were promised under the Civil Rights Act that were secured as part of the march. So I would add that to the list.
Yeah, agree with all of the above. And just to add to, there are other fixes that are needed to our discrimination laws. The courts over the last 60 years have erected all kinds of barriers to discrimination claims, in addition to the one that Liz mentions, which is huge. But also, they've erected these barriers such that it makes it nearly impossible for many victims of discrimination to get their day in court by upholding unconscionable arbitration agreements that workers never know that they were given or are subject to, much less, the right to obtain relief that is in any kind of significant way, or has enough of an impact to cause a large company to change its ways. And so often these cases, because the damages are capped so low, that companies, it's just a cost of doing business. And they continue, and without making changes to these discriminatory structures. So there are lots of ways and proposals to strengthen our civil rights laws and increase their enforcement so they can actually be the meaningful agents for change that were intended at the time that they were passed. when Title VII was enacted, the justification for it were things like higher unemployment rate, lesser occupational status, and lower income levels of minorities and women. I mean, that's straight out of the congressional record. Those conditions persist today, and the huge reason for it is because of ongoing employment discrimination. But because workers can't really access those protections, this conduct is allowed to continue. So we need to really look at our civil rights laws and make fixes where they're not working, or where courts have erected these barriers to bringing claims against companies. So that's just one additional thing, but totally agree with the need to raise the minimum wage and to invest in communities and these other proposals that my fellow panelists have raised.
Yeah. I think those are all really great, great opportunities to move policy forward, or to move people forward, really. Unfortunately, recently, we've seen a lot of challenges to racial progress, or to the progress that we have made since 1963. And for me, I know it can be easy to get discouraged with the regression. So to close out this portion of the conversation, could you each share with us one positive or hopeful action or development that you've seen in recent years that sort of gives you a little bit of hope that we can still move in the right direction?
Well, I want to go first this time because I don't want to be the last person to speak. But also because you mentioned the discouragement from and the attacks on our civil rights laws right now. So I wanted to say something a bit about that. So yes, we are seeing a full-scale, coordinated, well-funded attack on our civil rights laws by right-wing activists who are really trying to undermine the civil rights laws. Like they think that racism is over, and that they're forgetting about sort of where we've been and wanting to erase that history. And so this is a real threat to our racial progress. It's important to keep in mind, it's sort of to understand the strategies that are being employed. These groups are bringing a spate of lawsuits, high-profile lawsuits, attempting to weaponize the civil rights laws to roll back progress. But a lot of this is really meant to have a chilling effect, and it's kind of a fear-mongering tactic. But it's really important to understand that these lawsuits, in many cases, are being brought and motivated by sort of a political agenda, rather than what is actually lawful and what the civil rights laws allow. Because contrary to what our opponents are saying, for example, many of these race-conscious programs and DEI programs are not categorically discriminatory toward non-minorities or males. To the contrary, these programs were encouraged by Congress and are perfectly lawful today under existing law, and even in the wake of the college admissions cases. So we have a resource on our website that explains, the effect of the college admissions cases in the employment space, particularly because there has been a lot of, I think, misreporting on this and a misunderstanding of the way that Title VII works and the way that DEI works, and that the two are completely consistent with the law, and that should not change. And it's also not just consistent and important for compliance with existing Title VII obligations, but it's important that employers and companies continue these efforts, that they do everything that they can within the bounds of the law to advance the goals of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, for all the reasons we've said before on this panel. But we are as part of a coalition working to preserve this hard-fought progress and push back on these recent attacks. And we are seeing a lot of these cases getting dismissed because they're being brought without really the ability to show that anyone was actually discriminated against by DEI measures, and a lack of showing of the basic requirements to bring a lawsuit. Now, that being said, there is a federal judiciary right now that is largely pretty more sympathetic to these kinds of claims on behalf of non-minority males than probably a long time. So they need to be taken seriously. But I just wanted to address that and point people to those resources because, I think it's important to separate myth from fact and to realize sort of the motivation of these attacks and the importance of standing strong and continuing with these efforts.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie. We got a little bit of time real quick if more folks want to respond before I jump into the Q&A.
I'll just add one really quick. We are in a heyday of children's books and children's TV shows. And this is me just coming into this as a parent. And I saw a question in the Q&A about colorblindness and sort of how do we cultivate a conversation around anti-racist thinking among white communities. And I am feeling really, really excited and encouraged. I know there's a lot of book bans and they're trying to take these books away, but they are going to fail. They are everywhere and they are glorious. If you have not had the opportunity to go to a library or a children's bookstore recently, I highly encourage it. Like, we are in a better place and we are going to start with young children and they're going to have a different perspective on the world, themselves as change agents, what our problems are, where they came from, and how they can help to solve it and create the multiracial democracy we all deserve. So I will say that's one really encouraging thing that I see right now.
And I'll put in that, recent developments haven't so much depressed me because I just think our history is depressing enough that if we weren't making radical progress, again, the report we do was 60 years we haven't been making the progress, right? Or look even at the last year of King's life. I mean, King didn't die in retirement, after he won, right? He was killed, right? And there were hundreds of riots across the country reacting to that. And then there was a Poor People's Campaign that was supposed to put forth a kind of the multiracial alliance that was going to push forth this economic policy. And it ended with the National Guard kicking them out of DC. So there's always been this deep resistance to this, and the challenge is, how do you keep going, right? And I think, and again, looking at where we are today, we are still in a better space in many ways. So the racial wealth divide is ongoing, racial income inequality is ongoing, but I think we are in a better place to fight. We just have to be willing to fight and understand the depth of resistance. And again, the country was founded on racial economic inequality. It's truly revolutionary to change that. And that's the work we're doing. We're doing revolutionary work, not just trying to add a policy here or there or make more multiracial friends, but trying to radically change what the country's been doing for the last few hundred years.
And I'll add very quickly, even I know one of the questions in the chat was talking about speaking about young people and how even some of the recent developments can be cumbersome. I think that one of the things that I'm super duper proud of is the organizing and just the momentum of the labor movement right now, especially a lot of Black-led organizing, as we kind of mentioned. It's a really exciting time. I know I read it was this poll that found that 71% of Americans approve of labor unions, which was just astonishing to me. And it was the highest point since 1965. And I think that to see so many young people get excited about strikes, to get excited about labor history, to get excited about how the interconnectedness of labor history and racial justice, how closely tied those are, and how we really can't have one without the other. That motivates me, and I know I see that momentum shifting for a lot of others, and is probably one of the biggest inspirations for me personally to even be in this space, because I know that I'm part of something bigger. So yeah. that's definitely something positive and hopeful.
I appreciate all of those responses. I'm gonna jump to Q&A. I'm gonna group the questions. I know we've started to answer a couple of them, but I'm gonna try to group the questions in a way that makes sense. For this first round of questions, the first one is: many white Americans have adopted a colorblind approach to addressing systemic racism in the 21st century and see this as a solution rather than an anti-racist approach. Why is this problematic, and what can be done to promote a different outlook on combating racism? And I'm also going to pair that with the question about young folks. Many young people feel as though we're moving backwards due to the racist and antiquated policies that are being passed through legislatures and supported by the Supreme Court. For many, it can be incredibly disheartening and seem hopeless. What advice can you offer to young people as they are fighting against these oppressive systems? And I'll leave, anyone can answer either of those to start.
I'll just say that any kind of blindness is not a good way to see the world, right? Like, that is not what we should be striving for. And so, I mean, to say that color blindness is something we should be striving for is really, I think, misguided and dangerous. It's really more about ignorance and sort of a willful blindness to structural racism and our nation's racist past. And so I don't know if these people weren't around during the civil rights movement or just choose to ignore it. But now these folks who are arguing for a colorblind society, whatever that looks like, they're arguing that white people are actually the victims of discrimination. So I don't actually think that they believe in colorblindness. I think this is more about preserving white supremacy. I don't think that they like genuinely believe in colorblindness. I think it's more of a reactionary response to what they perceive as a threat. And this is what's really unfortunate, is that these anti-civil rights groups are really trying to drive wedges between groups, and that is not who we are. Like, that is not who we should be and who we should be striving to be. And what's beautiful about the coalition is that we refuse to be divided, right? Like, we understand that structural racism impacts all of us. It impacts us as a society, and it impacts, of course, some people much greater than others, but that it's our problem and that we all need to be working on it. So we refuse to accept this divisiveness or this colorblind fallacy. And as far as young people, and I mean, Adewale hit it perfect, but I agree. I think getting to work within a movement and within coalition and among and for the people is one of the greatest privileges of getting to work on this. And when you see successes in the lives of your clients or your community that you serve, that keeps you going, and that it's important that we provide that voice and that we continue to lift up and highlight that.
Yeah, just to jump in quickly on this, I think I would say two things. One is just recognizing how terrified so many bigoted white parents are, how terrified and angry they are about their own children's empathy. And their children read stories about really awful things that happened, and they see, they identify with the children for whom the awful thing happened. They see their community reflected in the people doing the awful thing, and they need help processing that. And the reaction of their parents has been to abdicate responsibility to help a child do a hard thing and to sort of criminalize the teaching in the first place. But it's a reminder that empathy is there and it is politically powerful. And this goes to Adewale's point about the organizing among young people. And I think there's a lot of really encouraging things there. The other piece I would add to this is really all of us being really thoughtful and intentional around the way that we tell data stories and the way that we use disaggregated data, because and keeping in mind that there are ways you can use it to reinforce racist narratives, and there are ways you can use it to advance anti-racist narratives. And we need data that talks about the origin of the problem and not just the current manifestation. When we're telling stories about racially disaggregated default rates, we need to put that in the context of employment discrimination and the barriers to repayment so that people are not left coming to racist conclusions. And so I think there's just one of the pieces we really, I think collectively could benefit from is intentionality around disaggregated data and the way we use that to help people understand the root causes so that they're not left coming to the conclusion that there's anything natural or inevitable about racially disparate outcomes.
I'm going to lift up, we have 2 questions in the chat that are about specific policy ideas. So one is about how much it would help to reduce disparities if we could revive the expanded child tax credit that expired after 2021, and then also thoughts about the potential role of a universal basic income.
Sure, I'll start off there. I do think too, we need to differentiate between what bridges racial income inequality, what bridges racial wealth inequality, and what still could be positive, even if it's not substantially bridging this income inequality and wealth inequality. I think maintaining the expanded child tax credit, I think, is a positive thing that can have positive impacts, in particular in the African-American community, but in for Americans across the country. I don't think it'll do much probably to bridge the racial wealth, the $10 trillion racial wealth divide as a whole, but I would still take it. I would still fight for it. I still think it's a good thing. Similarly, I think universal income, I think, would be something that probably have more substantive impact on bridging racial economic inequality, though that alone would not do it. And I think that's a helpful, positive, universal policy. But I do think we have to have programs that are designed to disproportionately affect African Americans at a very high level to bridge this inequality that we haven't seen being bridged over the last 60 years.
I was nodding my head a lot through what he had to say. I agree, both and. I think that the asset building policies that's been advocated for, the even momentum for reparations within states, I think that trying to attack these or redress maybe these issues in a targeted and race conscious way is probably the most direct way that we'd like to see some of these inequities and inequalities to be completely done away with. So agree with Diedrich, but just wanted to say that.
And if I could say one more thing, I also see a question in the chat about something about white supremacy as a distraction from anti-democratic hyper-concentration of wealth. I mean, in the 20th century and still in the 21st century, there's been nothing more anti-democratic and hyper-concentration of wealth than white supremacy. So it's not a distraction. It's like the center, it's like one of the central foundations of anti-democratic hyper-concentration of wealth has been white supremacy, and that's why we're talking about it in this context.
Thank you, Diedrich. So we are at time, I believe. I have learned a lot from this discussion. I've actually been writing notes as I've been moderating for things that I need to look into or look up or just think more deeply about. I am really grateful to the panelists who spoke today and shared with us and helped us to get a little bit further along in the path towards economic justice for Black communities. And I want to thank CEPR for hosting us and for hosting this discussion. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.